Vamos ter a Sonia de Quatelle, dos Estados Unidos, membro do Conselho Espírita Internacional, que nos irá falar sobre a morte e a vida espiritual na visão da doutrina espírita.
Boa tarde, queridos companheiros da língua portuguesa, da língua espanhola. Como a doutora Vanessa, na sessão da manhã, disse, nós estamos representando o movimento espírita americano e então falaremos na língua inglesa. Pedimos novamente a compreensão de todos vocês e a boa vontade. For all our friends from other lands who are here today, we also ask your comprehension. We really admire your efforts to understand all the languages that have been spoken in this meeting. And I'm very honored to stand here today, and I'd like to share with you some thoughts on the topic of death and spiritual life according to the Spiritist doctrine. Death. What is the definition of death? From the medical and legal point of view, death is the irreversible cessation of life, the end of spontaneous circulatory and respiratory functions. And translations? Sorry, translation, we are waiting for the translators. Is it okay now? Okay? Yeah? Okay. So, what is the definition of death? Let's see it again. From the medical and legal point of view, death is the irreversible cessation of life, the end of all spontaneous circulatory and respiratory functions, and the complete absence of total cerebral function that persists, that lasts for more than 30 minutes. The heart stops beating, and on the electrocardiogram, you see this frightening flat line. All the brain functions, the brain activities shown on the electroencephalogram by these brain waves that I'm sure you cannot see very well there, upon death, they come to a flat line. Death, confronted by this shocking and frightening reality, mankind has always tried to understand what happens when one dies. Allan Kardec opens Heaven and Hell, Chapter 1, with these questions. It's certain that we think and act. It's not less certain that we shall die. But on leaving earth, to what place shall we go? What will become of us? Can anything be more agonizing than the idea that we are all doomed to complete destruction? That our dearest affections, our loved ones, our intelligence, our knowledge, so laboriously acquired, are all to be dissolved, thrown away, lost forever. Why should we exhaust ourselves working, studying, if our exertions are to bear no fruit? If before long, maybe tomorrow, all that we have done is to be of no further use to us? Those are the questions that I'm sure comes to our minds many times. These questions have been haunted us for many, many years. And the ideas of the existence and immortality of the soul are innate in us and tell us that the end of existence is not our future. So the ideas of the existence of the soul, the ideas that the soul survives the body, emerged very early in civilization. Civilizations like the Chaldean, Egyptian, Hindu, just to mention a few of them. And this idea have also, like it was mentioned here before, have occupied the minds of a number of philosophers, wise men, like Plato, Pythagoras, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, and others, many, many others. Just an example. This excerpt is just a brief example of the ideas of Socrates and Plato, who lived about 400 years before Christ. They had a beautiful work about the soul. And in this excerpt, we read, if the soul is immaterial, then after this life, it will have to go to a world that is equally immaterial. The same way as the body decomposes and returns to matter. In fact, history tells us that Socrates, as you may know, was condemned to death. Death penalty already existed back then. And on his last day, all he was talking about with his disciples was the existence of the soul, the immortality, the survival of the soul. Pythagoras, who lived even earlier, about 500 years before Christ, also had many ideas about the soul. He also had the idea that the soul survived. Not only that, but he believed that the soul would migrate from one body to another. And he himself used to say that he remembered being born 4 times before he was finally born as Pythagoras. So what we call today reincarnation was already in the mind of Pythagoras 500 years ago, before Christ. And Pythagoras, as Socrates, as Jesus, never left any written word. They never really wrote anything. But this teaching, from many others, just as an example, has been attributed to Pythagoras. And it says, always make judicious and pondered choices to assure the victory of the best that lies in you, the spirit. Thus, when you abandon your body and ascend into the ether, you'll be immortal. You'll be an undying God, no longer a mortal. So this innate intuition that death is not the end of existence actually is vastly more common in mankind than the idea of people who believe in annihilation. The groups of the non-believers, also so-called freethinkers, believe that after death there is total destruction, there is nothing. Death means the end. But in fact, in most of the so-called freethinkers, there is more doubt than conviction, and there is more fear of annihilation that they care to show. But how can we explain then that among those who do believe that the soul survives, they still show a strong attachment to the earthly life, and they still have a great fear of death? Do I have to say more? Our great speakers in the morning, Alberto Almeida, already told us the fear that many people went through just flying, spiritists, flying to a spiritist convention and still afraid of dying during a flight. So all of us, we believe in the survival of the soul. We believe in life after death, but we are still afraid. Why is that? Because fear of death is a consequence of the instinct of preservation. This instinctive fear of death is another proof of God's wisdom. Do you know why? If were not for fear of dying, those who do believe that the self survives, goes to a better place, when they were afflicted by troubles, by disillusions, by despair, wouldn't they look the end of the existence to go to a better life? So they would too often seek the end of their own existence on earth. But we know now that the belief on the existence of the soul, the belief that the soul survives and we have a spirit life, needs to be accompanied by knowledge, by the ideas of why we live. Why do we need to have a terrestrial existence? And also, what awaits us on the other side? What is the spirit life? So, what do we know about the spirit world? Since the dawn of civilization, spirits, we have been visited by spirits, we have been inspired by them, but our poor understanding of the spirit language, the spirit communication, originated a great number of rituals of worship. So we were adoring gods, deities, elements of nature, thunder, the sun. We were adoring even objects. Verbal, visual, physical manifestations of the spirits start to occur and established a communication between the two worlds, the material and the spirit world. But still, we were not very ready yet. We were not clearly understanding what is the spirit life. And still, we created myths, doubt, confusion, and even fear. Until these manifestations of the spirits were critically observed by Kardec, based on scientific methodology that includes reproducibility and the absence of fraud and deception. Then these revelations of the spirits about the existence of a future life began to make more sense to us. All that fragmented information and unintelligible manifestation of the spirits were then decoded in a rational and enlightening form. It was born the Spiritist doctrine. And it was Kardec who said, and I quote, "It was not mankind who have discovered the spirit world, but the inhabitants of that world, the spirits themselves, who came to tell us that the spirit life existed, who came to describe their new condition." The communications from the spirit world started to appear all over the world. And it was in the United States in 1848 that we see the phenomena that was described as the Fox Sisters in New York, Hydesville. And this phenomena is considered a landmark of spirit communication. The Fox sisters, Margarita and Kate, at that time 11 and 13 years old approximately, start to hear these sounds. And through the tipology, or knocking, or spirit rappings, established a communication with the spirit of Charles Haydn, who told them through this methodology that they used that he had been murdered and buried in that house. The Fox sisters were severely criticized by the society that was very skeptical, by other religions, and they came out to say that it was all fake. They had produced the sounds themselves. Only 56 years later, the evidence came out. Because when this old house was then destroyed, they found the remains of a man, allegedly Charles Haydn, hidden behind a wall. So in the United States, there have been more reports of the communication with spirits, and now we can find these reports that date as early as 1890 or something around that time. But more recently, the interest in the afterlife started to grow. Hundreds and hundreds of cases of near-death and past life experiences have been carefully observed, recorded, analyzed, examined by a number of people, including physicians. Just to mention a few, and few of them were already mentioned here before by other speakers. Raymond Moody Jr., Ian Stevenson, Brian Weiss, Melvin Morse, several of them. Those are just a few, I repeat. They conducted studies completely independent of beliefs, doctrinal beliefs, or religion. And through these studies, they attest to a very active spirit life. So through their studies, completely independent of religion, they still show that life beyond death exists. It was very interesting that the reports, the recollections of the testimony of people who underwent near-death experiences were so strikingly similar, and this similarity piqued the interest of several scientists. So several studies are now starting to show into the researches into the physical and behavioral changes that follow near-death experiences. There are many publications in very prestigious medical and scientific journals. And just to mention a few, there are very recent studies that show chain waves of people who underwent near-death experiences. Those studies in the neuroscience are growing in number. Another scientist has proposed a new study to understand changes that happens also in in people who undergo near-death experiences. This study that he is proposing now is going to cost $80,000. So you see the interest of the scientists in the matter that goes beyond the body. There is a research, one of these researches that was published in a journal called Lancet. This is one of the most prestigious journals in medicine, and it was published very recently in 2001. And this is a prospective study including 334 cases of cardiac arrest in the Netherlands. And they found a percentage of 18%. They found a rate of 18% of near-death experiences among the patients, there's 334 cases of people who were resuscitated after the cardiac arrest. So these scientists were studying all the recollections from these patients. And they were really curious. And at the end of the paper, in the conclusion, we find the question that the scientists pose themselves. They are asking, how could a clear consciousness outside of one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with a flat EEG? So what they are asking is, the person is undergoing a near-death experience. The body is clinically dead, if you remember the definition. Flat line on the electroencephalogram, no activity in the brain. How come this person can still tell us in detail what was happening during that period? So they suspect there is something that is functioning out of the body that is completely inactive. They continue on their observations that blind people have also described very veridical perception during these out-of-body or near-death experiences. Again, how can a person who is blind describe what was happening in details, precise details, what was happening at the time that the body was completely inactive? So these are very interesting questions that have been raised now by scientists. But those were not the first scientists to deep in what's going on out of the body. Albert de Rochat, who was a scientist in the early 1900s, was very interested on the existence of the soul. He himself used magnetism to induce regression to past lives and to collect experiences, to collect reports from these people. And in his book, published in 1911, called Successive Lives, he declares in chapter 4 that his work was done completely independent of the ideas of the Spiritist doctrine. Why does he say that? If you note, when he published this, it's approximately 60 years after the Spiritist doctrine emerged. So he wanted to say that, okay, he comes to very similar conclusions. But he wanted to say that he was not influenced at all by the Spiritist doctrine. This was a work developed under scientific methodology. Similarly, Camille Flammarion, who became then a follower of Kardec, as we know, and was born approximately 40 years after Kardec, he also was very interested in the existence of the soul and the wonders of the soul in the material and the spirit life. He published a book called Death and Its Mystery in 1922. And he says the soul is independent of the material organism and continues to live after death. So that's one of his conclusions at the end of his book. But he adds, the conclusions achieved are the result of my own free and independent work, with no affiliations with creeds or religion systems. He was Kardec's admirer. But yet, he wanted to make sure that his scientific work was corroborating the ideas, but was not influenced by these ideas. It was Kardec who said in Genesis, Spiritism and science complement each other, as science without Spiritism found itself with no power to explain certain phenomena, just using the laws of matter, On the other hand, Spiritism without science would lack support and corroboration. That's what we see is happening now. I would like to make a remark. We are not saying that science has acknowledged the existence of the soul. As Raul said in the opening session on this meeting, science formally did not acknowledge that yet, but scientists, independent scientists, are now working on subjects that are going beyond the existence of the body itself. So these scientists, through their own work, have come to a conclusion. Death does not exist. In fact, life lies in the spirit and not in the body. And we have a continuous process of alternating existence between the material and the spirit world. Leon Denis, in his book After Death, published in 1897, states, "There is no better analogy for the phenomenon of death than that of the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to butterfly." He says, man lies in a cocoon that death disintegrates. The spirit after death returns to spirit life, which follows corporeal life as day follows night. This same analogy of the metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly was used later in the book called Advancement in Two Worlds by the spirit André Luiz, in automatic writing by Francisco Xavier and Valdo Vieira. The process of metamorphosis. In this process, we see that the caterpillar comes out of the egg and then grows, matures. Upon reaching maturity, it stops feeding. The digestive system, the muscular system stops, becomes quiescent, and the caterpillar then seeks protection in the soil or in a plant. The salivary gland secretion as a silk, in form of silk threads, together with soil particles, plant particles, make a shell around the caterpillar that now is named pupa. And here we see what we call a cocoon. It's a shell that's involving the caterpillar that is now undergoing a complete transformation and adaptation for a new life. And when the process of metamorphosis is completed, out of the shell comes a vibrant butterfly. So the analogy is that we as humans, from birth to death, live as the caterpillar. And some say just crawling on the ground. But upon death, when our body decays, we fly out. But is this idea of a butterfly a good analogy? Kardec already asked that question. In question 158 of the Spirit's book, Kardec asks whether the example of the caterpillar that encapsulates itself in a cocoon and finally comes out in a radiant existence gives us an adequate idea of our terrestrial life, the body in the grave, and our new existence as a spirit. And the Spirit's answer, it's only a very scanty idea, very incomplete idea. The analogy is good, but it shouldn't be taken literally. Why it shouldn't be taken literally? The image of a butterfly reminds us of beauty, lightness, happiness. And are we all like that? Sometimes we come out of the shell as a beautiful butterfly. Many times we come out of the shell as a dark moth. So, what do we know about the spirit life? Through the spirits themselves, we have learned that in the spirit life there is happiness and unhappiness. And the state of happiness or unhappiness in the spirit world is a mere consequence of the degree of advancement or the degree of imperfection of that spirit. We also have learned that there is no eternal punishment. Scientists, through their own observations, that were once skeptical, now have come to the conclusions that our future in the spirit life is a consequence of our own acts in the material life. Isn't this familiar? Have we seen this before? Of course. This topic was extensively studied by Kardec and is compiled in his book, Heaven and Hell. So, death is not the end, some scientists are saying now. Isn't this statement contrary to the scientific and legal definition of death? Who remembers what this definition says? Probably nobody, huh? So let's remind you. From the medical and legal point of view, death is the irreversible cessation of life. Life does not exist. So is the statement that death is not the end contrary to this definition? No, it's not. Because this definition says nothing about the spirit. This definition is entirely in regard of material body. And science, as we said before, still does not acknowledge the existence of the spirit. So now we know, now we learned that death does not exist, that our life continues beyond. But are we spiritists afraid of death? Kardec, in his enlightening words in Heaven and Hell, says, and we quote, "It is the knowledge of the nature and details of life in the spirit world that enables spiritists to see death with calmness and give us serenity to the last moments upon earth. What sustains a spiritist is not a mere hope, but a certainty, as a spiritist knows that the future life is a continuation of the present one, only under more favorable conditions." So, no more fear, no more agony. Death, according to the Spiritist doctrine, is only a process of transition from the material to the spirit world when the organic life ends in the material body. The spirit lives, and the spirit goes on carrying all the experiences and the knowledge. Nothing is lost, because true life resides in the spirit and not in the body. I would like to thank the organizing committee of the 4th Spiritist World Congress and the United States Spiritist Council for the privilege to present this talk today. I would like to deeply thank the enlightened spirits who gave me the intuitions, who inspired me for this talk. I would like to thank the Allan Kardec Spiritist Society of Maryland for the support, Vanderlei Marques, Eli Reis, and José Maria da Silva for reviewing the content of this presentation, for the valuable suggestions, and Dr. Donald Saletti for the editorial review, and I would most like to thank all of you who are here today. you.